Hi everyone. Now that we have focused on setting, I'd like us to move on to characterisation. Now, this will be a bit of a recap for quite a lot of you, but the reason I wanted to go back over characterisation, even though that we had explored the characters of Jackson and his wife in class before the holidays, was because quite a lot of people's attendance was a little bit sporadic. And also, I think that it's really beneficial because if you get a set text paper, the likelihood of you being asked about a particular character or a particular character trait is the chance of that's quite high. So I would really like us to go back over this. If there's bits that you already have notes of, then please feel free to skip on to a later part of this presentation. But if you hear anything that I'm going to say about characterisation in this presentation that you didn't know previously, or you were absent when we had gone over it before in class, can you please make sure that you do note it down either by annotating your own copy of the short story home or by making your own notes, however it is that you like to do that. Okay, so the two main characters in the short story Home are Mr. and Mrs. Jackson. Now, for anybody who's not seen Keeping Up Appearances, this is what I always imagine Mr. and Mrs. Jackson to be like. If you've never seen the show Keeping Up Appearances with these two people in it, then please watch it because it's they're really the characters are really really close to the characters in Home. So first of all, I'm just going to briefly go over the characterisation of both Jackson and his wife, and then set you some tasks to do to explore their characters in more detail. Probably actually more detail than what we would have done in class as well. So it'll be beneficial for everybody, whether you were in class all the time or not. I'll start off with the characterisation of Jackson first of all. But before I do that, what do we mean by characterisation? Well, characterisation in a short story or a novel or a poem or a play or anything at all, film, anything, characterisation refers to the construction of a character by a writer. So, how have they made the character the way that they are? Character's personality, we've talked about this before, the character's looks, the character's dress, the character's body language, the way that they move, the way that they walk, their facial expressions. All of that tells us something about a character. So, how has the writer presented that character to us? How have they showed us this is the way that this character is? This is their personality. This is what they're like. So, with Jackson, the way that Iain Crichton Smith has portrayed Jackson's character is he's presented him as being in control and dominant, arrogant, racist, and also alienated. So Jackson spends the majority of the short story feeling like he doesn't belong. The only time that Jackson feels like he belongs somewhere is towards the end of the short story, where he gets to the first class hotel and he's surrounded by like-minded people, people of a similar social class than him, and that's where he starts to feel comfortable and at home. But for the majority of the story, his character feels alienated. He feels like an outcast. Now I'm going to get you to do a task on this particular on these particular character traits of Jackson. And I'll show you an example of what I'm going to get you to do. Then I'll show you um, the exact sheet that I'm going to get you to fill out. So if we just look at Jackson's first character trait here, where I had said that he's portrayed as being in control and dominant. This is what I would like you to do. I'm going to give you a sheet where we have um, three areas here. We have context, quotation, and analysis. And what I'm going to ask you to do is to explore the context of certain parts of the story in which we see Jackson being in control and dominant. So if we look at this first example here under context, it says, the story opens with a description of Jackson. Okay, so that's the context of the story. That's what's happening in the story at that time. Then I'm going to give a quotation that backs up that context. So I've said, the black polished car drew up. He was a big man with a weather-beaten, red-veined face and a strong jaw. He looked both competent and hard. So by describing Jackson's looks there, Iain Crichton Smith is demonstrating that he is in control and dominant just by what he looks like. So now I have to analyse that and explain how this description, how's this quotation of Jackson, how that shows that he's in control and dominant. And I've said, Jackson appears from the outset to be powerful and wealthy. His appearance creates an immediate contrast to the setting of the Glasgow tenement. Jackson clearly does not realise that his wealth will make him a conspicuous visitor to this area, and it will serve, as the story progresses, to emphasise to the current residents that he no longer belongs there. So the fact that he has this this black polished car, it's not just a sort of like run down like little car that he's pulling up in. It's a polished car that draws up. That's what shows him. That's what shows the reader that he is powerful, wealthy, in control right from the outset. His appearance as well, with this weather-beaten, red-veined face with a strong jaw, looking competent and hard, that is that very, very strong and dominant face that he has, that physical appearance that he has, is directly in contrast to the Glasgow tenement, which we know has scars on the walls. We've looked at that when we were looking at setting. The walls are scarred, which gives an indication that the walls of the tenement are like broken, disfigured, which has connotations of weakness. But Jackson, in contrast to that, he's not like that. He has a hard look. He has a strong jaw. He's not scarred, he's strong. So that's where the contrast lies between him and the actual tenement flat. I've given you another example here as well. Both of these examples are on the sheet that I'm going to give you, so you don't need to copy these down at all. So the context, the part of the story for my second example, is the bit where Jackson and his wife have arrived at the home they shared for 5 years in Glasgow when they were first married. So it's just, that context bit is just a brief summary of what's happening in the story at that time. And the quotation that I've given to show that part of the story is, with a hungry look, as if he were scanning the veldt. Now, if you were in school before the holidays when we were studying home, you will have remembered that we did a vocabulary finding quiz, and veldt was one of the words that I had asked you to look up and write down the meaning of. If you haven't done that, there is the PowerPoint for that vocabulary quiz is in the files section of our Teams page. So with that quotation, my analysis of it, remember I'm still having to analyse this in the context of the character trait of Jackson, that he is in control and dominant. So how does that quotation show the reader that he is in control and dominant? Well, what I've said is, Jackson is characterised here by Crichton Smith as being hungry. So I've broken the quotation here. I'm analysing the word hungry. This word choice as a predator who will prey on others if it is to be of benefit to him. The veldt in South Africa, where he has emigrated to, suggests he has learned in his new home to be intimidating and dominating to others he conceives to be inferior. If you remember, the veldt is a huge expanse of grasslands, and it's almost like Jackson is scanning this huge exterior, looking for his prey, looking for something or someone to pounce on, and that's what shows that he's in control and dominant. So I'll show you the full document that I'm going to get you to complete. So this is it here. So you'll find this in the files section of our Teams page. It will be under the set text folder, and it will be in the home folder under materials and handouts. So it's the characterization of Jackson, and you'll see here that I've put character trait 1 in control and dominant, and these two here are the quotation are the examples that I've just shown you on the PowerPoint. If you scroll down a little bit here, you'll see 3 other quotations, and what you need to do, and you can type this or you can write it, it's up to you, but what you need to do is put in the context for each of these quotations and then an analysis for each of them as well. Then once you've completed that, you'll see that there is character trait 2 from the PowerPoint, which is showing that that Jackson is arrogant. So again, you'll see a couple of full context quotation and analysis examples here, so you can have a read over of those to see how I am linking the quotations to the fact that Iain Crichton Smith wants us to believe that Jackson is arrogant. And then after that, scroll down. There's another one at the bottom as well, but the 2 in the middle, you need to figure out the context and do the analysis yourselves. Then, similarly with character trait 3, where Jackson is shown to be racist, I've given you 1 example there. So 1 example of context, 1 quotation, and an analysis of that quotation showing how Jackson is portrayed as racist in the short story. And there's another full example at the bottom, but again, there's 2 quotations in the middle there where you have to do the context and the analysis yourselves. And then the same for character trait 4, where Jackson feels alienated, and there's some full examples again, and some opportunities for you to figure out the context and explain the analysis yourselves. Okay, so if I go back to our PowerPoint here, I'm going to move on to the characterization of Mrs. Jackson now. I should say that if you want to just get on with the analysis of Jackson's character traits, then just pause this video now, and you can just go away, find that document that I've just shown you, that Word document in the files section. So again, it'll be under files, under set text, and it'll be under in the home folder. So you can just get on with that just now and just pause this video at this point. However, if you want to continue, I'm going to move on to Mrs. Jackson just now and just give you a brief explanation of the character of Mrs. Jackson. And this picture here is just how I imagine Mrs. Jackson to be, very like snobby and very sort of like up herself kind of thing, and very affronted by other people and their behaviour and judging them. So the character of Mrs. Jackson is presented as being the following things by Iain Crichton Smith. She is portrayed as being disdainful and cruel, a snob, unsympathetic, and ashamed of her roots. She doesn't like where she comes from. So make sure that you've got this in your notes, okay? These are just very, very brief notes, but now I'm going to give you a chance to explore these different character traits. Please do the character traits, please explore the character traits of Jackson using that Word document first if you've not already done so. But once you've completed that document, that Word document to do with Jackson, then you can move on to the next task on the following page that I'd like you to do for Mrs. Jackson. So likewise, like with Mr. Jackson, for the first character trait of Mrs. Jackson, which is disdainful and cruel, I've given you a couple of examples of context, quotation, and analysis. So you're doing the exact same thing as you did with Jackson. So if we keep in mind this first character trait of disdainful and cruel, I've picked a section of the story that shows that she is disdainful and cruel, which is: having arrived outside their old tenement, Mrs. Jackson responds to her husband's comment about the past. So that comment is just me summarising the bit of the story that I'm talking about. Then I'm given the quotation. She smiled disdainfully. And I've said, well, the reason that this shows that she's disdainful or cruel is pretty obvious because it's in the quotation, but I still need to fully analyse it. This demonstrates a lack of respect for her husband. She thinks he is being naive and stupid in thinking that it is still safe to leave a car unlocked, and suggests that they are at odds with one another over the visit. Okay, so remember all the time that your analysis should be showing how the quotation proves the character trait that that you should be focusing on. The next piece of context that shows that, so the next part of the story that shows that Mrs. Jackson is disdainful or cruel is Mrs. Jackson and her husband have returned to where they started their married life, and Jackson is reminiscing about the past. And the quotation from that part of the story is, "You were lazy. That is what was wrong with you." And the reason that this quotation, this is what Mrs. Jackson says, the reason that this shows that she is disdainful or cruel is that Jackson's wife doesn't wish to think nostalgically about the past, and her conflict with her husband over this is apparent. In her memory, she is the one who pushed until Jackson made something of himself. She believed he was lazy and wouldn't have had the motivation to improve himself. Okay, so if I go to this this document here, so this is a different document to the last one, but you'll still find it in the same place on Teams under the files section. So this is the characterisation of Mrs. Jackson this time, and if you see, I've outlined the character traits one by one, and then given the examples of context, quotation, and analysis. So these two here are the two that I have just shown you on the PowerPoint, and then if you look further down, you will see a couple of other quotations and examples from the short story, but this time, like with the Jackson document, you now need to find the context. So give a brief summary of where in the story this is happening, what's happening when this quotation is said in the story, and then analyse how do each of these quotations show that Mrs. Jackson is disdainful and or cruel. The same with character trait 2, where she's a snob, and I've given you a couple of examples here that show how snobby she is, that give you an idea of her snobbishness. And then there are 3 quotations that, in my opinion, they are prime quotations that show how snobby a character Mrs. Jackson is, but where in the story is this happening, so the context, and how does the quotation show that Mrs. Jackson is snobby, the analysis. Same thing for character trait 3, where she's unsympathetic, and the same for character trait 4, where she's ashamed of her roots. By this point, you will be an absolute dab hand at doing these. So what I've done is, for character trait 3 and for character trait 4, I have left a blank row at the bottom of the grid for character trait 3 and for character trait 4. This is for you to find your own quotations for character trait 3 and 4. And so that you can put in your own context, your own quotation, and your own analysis, and you don't have to sort of stick to quotations that I'm continually giving you. You'll probably come up with quotations that you think are better than the ones that I've given in the PowerPoint and in the Word documents as well. That's absolutely fine. If you do find quotations where you think, oh, I would rather have used that, make a note of them in your notes, or make a note of them by annotating your copy of the short story. Okay, so if you would like to go away and do the and complete the grids for Mrs. Jackson's character traits, then please pause the video now and go away and do that. Or if you prefer, you can just continue with me, and we'll move on to the next section of characterization. So the last part of characterization focuses on the minor characters, and the minor characters are the Jamesons, the Factor, and Nikki and Charlie. If you remember, Nikki and Charlie are two of the punks that sort of run Jackson and his wife out of town. So the Jamesons are characterised in this way. The Jamesons are characterised by being involved with domestic violence. If you remember, Jackson remembers Mr. Jameson very fondly, but it's Mrs. Jackson that has to remind him that she saw Mrs. Jameson with a black eye. Mr. Jameson was a big drinker, and there's a lot of things that point towards the fact that Mr. Jameson was violent towards his wife. So they are those minor characters are engulfed by this idea of domestic violence being in their lives. They had petty religious arguments surrounding Catholics and Protestants, and the heavy drinking comes into it as well. Mrs. Jackson makes reference to that. The Factor is the second minor character. We know of the Factor because Mr. Jackson had conversations with him about the state of his old tenement flat. So when he visits the tenement, he remembers these humiliating conversations that he used to have with the Factor, which, if you remember from the setting PowerPoint, that those conversations made Mr. Jackson feel like he was being treated like a black, as he says in his words, that he feels like he was looked down upon, treated like dirt by the Factor, and treated contemptuously by the Factor as well. And being treated contemptuously, being looked down upon, being treated like dirt was something that in the 1970s, when this was set, that treatment was really just expected to happen towards black people. That shows the theme of overt racism as well, and that also shows that Mr. Jackson is has racist beliefs himself. But going back to the Factor, with the Factor's character traits that we see is that he is quite tight with money. He doesn't want to spend anything on Jackson's tenement flat by helping to do it up or helping to get rid of the mice or the damp or anything like that. And he's very unsympathetic. He doesn't care about his tenants, and certainly doesn't care about the plight that Jackson finds himself in by having to live in this dirty, damp, horrible, cold tenement flat in the old days in Glasgow. The last two minor characters are Nikki and Charlie, who are the punks. They are very threatening and potentially violent. They never get physically violent with the Jacksons, but the tension builds at that point. That key incident where the Jacksons run into Nikki and Charlie. That is the key incident in the story, which we'll talk about more later on. But the reason that is the climax or the key incident is because the tension has built to a crescendo at that point. And we fear, as the reader, the violence that might come from that confrontation. It doesn't happen, but there always seems to be a glimmer of potential violence hiding under the surface of everything that the punks say to Mr. Jackson. They tell the Jacksons that they don't belong in Glasgow. They call them tourists, and they represent the change in the neighbourhood. Because they call the Jacksons tourists and tell them that they don't belong there, that shows that they don't recognise anything of themselves in the Jacksons. and vice versa. The Jacksons don't recognise anything in the punks of themselves either. So that leads Mr. Jackson to think to himself, after the punks have sort of run him out of town, Mr. Jackson thinks to himself, oh, look at how changed the place is. He says that he can't recognise the place anymore, and that's because Nicky and Charlie, these so-called punks, represent that huge change in the neighbourhood. Okay. So that's us come to the end now, guys. So if you haven't yet completed the 2 tasks on Jackson or Mrs. Jackson, please go forward with those. We don't have time in class to be either online or physically in class to go over looking up quotations and analyses for the more minor characters. That's something that we just don't have time to go over. So what I would suggest is doing that in your own study time. So whenever you're studying for your set text for English, set aside some time at some point to have a look in more detail at each of these minor characters and pick out quotations that show each of these different character traits for them. Okay, thank you.